A woman choosing to start a family alone today can expect to spend minimum around $60,000 in the US in order to make that happen. Okay. This is what issue 5 of the Single Woman Economy Brief is going to be focused on, the Solo Motherhood Premium. As you know, we discuss the economics of being a single woman in modern society. So this is a topic that's been on my radar for quite some time. Really looking forward to sharing some of the research and the insights that I have indeed found. So in one of the comments, actually, in one of my previous issues of this publication, somebody had actually raised a hand and said they are thinking about money specifically because they will be pursuing solo motherhood. And I had a really good look at what reports and also online forums exist in this space. Now, there are a number of podcasts out there whereby solo motherhood is discussed. And of course, they take in a broad range of topics really around preparation. They do, of course, talk about the finance element of it. Really interesting. There's this growing cluster of podcasts where women are coming together and discussing the process end to end. But I also found this economic hardship reporting project that was shared in The Cut in March 2026, so not too long ago. And I also found a Reddit group, of course, which is Single Mothers by Choice. Really interesting group. And one of the kind of very common recurring comments and questions that came up was, can someone tell me that my situation is not unique? Okay. Women who might be losing faith every day and they want to know if it is possible, especially when it comes to how much they earn on an annual basis. So this really is an important question because actually, solo motherhood in particular forces, I suppose, us to really think about the economics of parenting, because of course you're not able to rely or count into the cost a second income necessarily. Now, I want to also mention at this point, a lot of the research, when I tried to find statistics and reports, etc., is between the UK and the US. And in the full report, I talk about that. But to live comfortably in the US, for example, a single adult needs about £106,000 a year. Now, this came from a report. Now, this is give or take. That isn't to say that that is the average salary, of course, okay? As you saw in that example I shared before, taken straight from the Reddit group, that was a woman who's 32 years old who earns around 56,000, okay, a year. Now, obviously, this is when you are a single income household, you are covering all of the costs of the household, generally speaking, by yourself. And so, a woman who is seeking solo motherhood is not only carrying the cost of running a home on one income. And I have talked in previous issues about what exactly that looks like, right? We did a breakdown of what it means to run a single income as a single economic actor. Do go and check out the previous brief where I break that down. But you're also carrying the cost of raising a child, okay? Now, here's the thing, of course, it's solo motherhood by choice. So, of course, these are choices that women are making for various reasons. But inevitably, there is still a double premium. And of course, most systems are built around two parents. It's built on a two-parent default, okay? It is assumed in society and by systems that touch childcare, parenting, etc., that there are two adults who share the money responsibilities, but also share the actual responsibility of raising children. I did mention earlier, and in the Substack version of this, I break down some of the costs associated when it comes to pursuing solo motherhood by choice. And you have to understand, it's like a line by line breakdown. It's not just one thing. It's the fertility treatment, it's the testing, it's the storing of eggs as well. If that's a route that you've gone down, then it's the actual treatment to implant. There's literally a line by line breakdown of what it really costs to become a solo mother. These obviously are in dollars because a lot of the statistics that were available were US based, okay? But of course, this cost can rise. For example, if you are looking at surrogacy in the US, the costs will rise and they will be aligned with, how surrogacy is dealt with. Legal fees, for example, paying for medical costs. This is like a brief cost stack, as it were, in terms of donor sperm. This I found fascinating, okay? You pay per vial, and of course, in some places in the world, it will be different depending on where you are. There's a recommendation about how many vials you may actually need. Then you've got IVF, you pay per cycle, medication, testing has to be paid for, donor and parental legal fees, depending upon your circumstance, complex cases. I mentioned things like surrogacy as well, because often it's assumed that a woman is actually giving birth to the child herself, but you can pursue solo motherhood and use a surrogate. And then, of course, in the US specifically, there are costs associated with delivery, whether it's, cesarean or otherwise. Now, of course, the difference is in the UK, some of these costs it depends on where you live, geography, policies. Some of these costs, of course, you don't pay for outright, like the delivery one. If you are, in the NHS, for example, as a patient, you won't necessarily be charged for the actual birth of the child, right? So there are cost differences depending on where in the world you are going through this process. The other thing I thought was interesting, of course, is that when you are a solo motherhood, when you pursue solo motherhood, in certain places in the world, you also have to calculate the time that you take off of work when you give birth. And of course, as we know, paid leave and leave in general is dealt with differently again in different places in the world. So that is actually a cost analysis too. I know when I was reading the stories, there were women who obviously would save money so that when they do take a maternity leave, they could still support themselves, they could maintain the lifestyle that they were indeed living before. And so a lot of women have to calculate and be aware of what leave provisions there are in their particular workplace. What does their particular employer offer, and how will that impact them economically? Okay. And so in some places, working women don't get paid leave by default, even though they might well become a parent, right? And of course, if you are a solo mother, if you have a single income household, there is no second income covering the gap when you are not working. And I think that is also an economic factor, right? It's something pragmatically you have to think about if this is actually what you are pursuing. Now, we've talked before about the wealth gap, in general, in terms of different intersections here. But, and I should have said this, actually, really important thing that came out of the research I found interesting. Of course, when you're looking for data and research, first of all, single women are often not filtered in all of the research, right? We'll say single people. And then when it comes to solo motherhood, the way we define that, so do we mean single mothers, divorced mothers, or solo mothers? And this is the thing, when I was doing the research here, I was very specifically looking for solo motherhood experiences as opposed to the other types of one parent households, okay? Because we are specifically looking at the cost of it, particularly making it happen, much less the cost of raising a child thereafter, okay? But statistically speaking, what we see is solo mothers by choice are usually older, university educated, and maybe settled in their careers. Of course, this is an average. It does not represent by any stretch all of the demographic makeup of solo mothers. So that I thought was very interesting when you look at the wealth gap more generally, right? Usually people are talking about single mothers, but actually if you look at the average income or the salary range of the average solo mother, it's different. So the big question often is can a woman on an average income actually afford this? Or does it only really work for women who are already at the top, whatever that means, right? But we're talking about people who earn above average in terms of salary, in terms of being able to cover the costs of actually conceiving, going through with the pregnancy and giving birth. And one of the things I found fascinating from looking at the stories, like so some of the anecdotal data out there, was that some women literally acknowledged that this might even be a class issue. And I think there are bigger conversations happening right now around fertility and women, where this is an honest conversation happening. The ability, the option, the access to, freeze eggs, the access to delay having children, that access is predetermined often by income and maybe socioeconomic status, essentially. And so there is a broader conversation around, even though there might be more research and more coverage around fertility later in life, solo motherhood, etc., that doesn't mean that all women have the financial access to take advantage of some of these technological advances as well. Okay. Now, what I also found interesting is that when I looked at the reporting, is that there are some women who do pay for this kind of treatment with loans. Some take out credit card debt, and then other people switch careers on purpose to be able to earn more. So they're planning in advance to make sure that they have the salary that they believe is necessary, but also that they have the savings as well. Very interesting. And the truth is that if you are a woman on an average income or lower, it is not necessarily going to be a comfortable, smooth journey financially. Okay. But a lot of people do make it work by taking on real financial risk. I think what's also broadly what came up in the research is, for example, single women adopting. Right. So, of course, we've talked about solo motherhood in terms of conceiving and giving birth to a child. But there is another category in terms of solo motherhood, to be fair, like I say, is women adopting children, which doesn't necessarily require the same financial output as surrogacy in the US, for example, or going through fertility treatment from scratch, right? If you are adopting a child, you will go through a process, system essentially, depending on where you live in the world. But the costs would look they do look very different, okay? The costs may well be associated with the actual raising of the child as opposed to the conception and the giving birth, the pregnancy, etc. But I also thought that was an important category, so to speak, to mention. So look, a lot of the time, and I saw this kind of being raised a lot in the forums that I found, where people would say, well, you chose this, so if it's hard, it's your problem. This was your choice. And look, choosing something doesn't remove the cost. And I think this is true of couples having children, right? Couples decide to have children and still express and share the challenges associated with the specific financial challenges and the economic reality of raising children. So, in the context of solo motherhood, it is what it is. You still are paying for what the system might actually have expected or be accounting for, that two parents would usually cover. So, I love to have a little bit of a horizon scan and think about industries to watch. I go into this in more detail in the actual report itself. But I think what's interesting about the fertility and reproductive health sector is, some of the coverage, for example, is still built for two-person households. Sometimes, depending on where you live, particularly in the US, in terms of the diagnosis of infertility, there's a process that you have to follow. And although a lot of clinics have become more inclusive in that process, sometimes insurance hasn't caught up around that either. Also, there is a Senate bill in California, which I thought was very interesting, that now counts single people for fertility coverage. Okay, it doesn't pay for the donor sperm, etc., but it does count single people in, so that definition is actually being broadened. Then when it comes to life insurance and estate planning, I thought this was interesting too, because of course, that will look slightly different as a solo mother. Okay. There are many workarounds, but it's still quite clunky and fragmented in terms of how you ensure that your estate planning and life insurance is suitable for your family format. Employer benefits design. I mentioned earlier that there's a reality for women that, you have to check what your workplace offers in terms of, and in regards to, leave. But the same goes for the benefits that are available to you as well. And so, as usual, when you look at the rise in single adults in general, much less single women, I think it will be interesting to see how employers evolve their benefits packages, so that they do speak to and really acknowledge the fact that not everybody's in a partnered household, for starters. Okay, not everybody is indeed in a partnered household. So yeah, that is really about it. And I would obviously we would love to see more sectors, and specifically certain products and services being designed or redesigned to recognize, okay, that single adults exist, first of all, but single women exist, and the way that we are navigating life and our finances are very, very different to the way, for example, coupled and partnered households might well be doing. So that's it, really. That is the Solo Motherhood issue 5 brief, and I'm really enjoying these, and I'm constantly iterating the format and structure each week to make sure that it's accessible. That's why there is indeed a Substack and LinkedIn version, as well as this video version if you just wanted to get the highlights essentially of this week's brief. So I'll see you in the next one.